The Treaty of Versailles was a monumental treaty that concluded Allied hostilities with Germany at the end of World War I.
In the early 20th century, Europe was teetering on the brink of war. In late July of 1914, a Serbian extremist assassinated the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand. Thus, Austria declared war on Serbia. Because of a network of defensive treaties, almost all of Europe became involved in a war.
The two belligerents were known as the Entente and the Central Powers. The Entente, also known as the Allies, included England, France, Russia, Serbia, Italy, and later the United States.
The Central Powers included Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey.
The result was a long and bloody war. Of the 65 million soldiers mobilized by both sides, 8.5 million soldiers were killed, and 21 million soldiers were wounded.
After 4 long years of fighting, the German delegation met with the Allied Supreme Commander, Ferdinand Foch, on November 8, 1918. The resulting treaty outlined a temporary armistice between Germany and the Allies. It was formally signed on November 11th, taking effect 11 a.m. that same day.
On January 18, 1919, leaders of the Allied powers convened in Paris to begin talks about the treaty. The key leaders in the peace talks were Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of England, George Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, and Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy. Note that Germany was not involved in the peace talks. Each of the leaders came to the table with different ideas of what should be included in the treaty. Woodrow Wilson brought his famous 14 points to the table, which included that countries are to reduce weapon numbers, that France should be fully liberated and be allowed to recover Alsace-Lorraine, that an independent Poland should be created, which should have access to the sea, and that a League of Nations should be set up to guarantee the political and territorial independence of all states and other key issues. Woodrow Wilson was probably the most lenient leader of the peace talks. In contrast, George Clemenceau was the most harsh delegate, demanding that Germany be punished for the war. Prime Minister David Lloyd George was more balanced and helped to moderate the extreme beliefs of Clemenceau and the idealistic beliefs of Wilson. Finally, Vittorio Orlando contributed very little to the peace talks. In fact, Orlando left the peace conference early due to a territorial dispute.
When the Treaty of Versailles was finally signed by both Germany and the Allied powers, it contained 440 articles. But the key ones are as follows. The German army had to be limited to only 100,000 men, and no large artillery pieces, tanks, or aircraft were allowed for the military. Military reserves were to be decreased. Once a soldier, you were a soldier for at least 12 years, and if you were an officer, you were obliged to stay for at least 25 years. A general staff was not permitted. No staff, no war plans, and no war plans, no war. The German Navy was limited to 6 cruisers, including only 2 old battleships and 4 smaller ships for port duty. Submarines were totally eliminated. These were one of the main parts of the Allies' worries in World War I. The treaty itself gave large parts of Germany to France, Denmark, Poland, Britain, and Belgium. However, the U.S. was the one country that didn't get any land out of the deal. This point of the treaty caused Germany to be very upset, but there was nothing that it could do about it. According to the Allies, the Germans had to pay. One of the last conditions was one of the most controversial in history. Germany was declared responsible for the war and had to pay reparations. The total cost was to be calculated as equal to the damages caused by the war to civilian property. The total was $33 billion. The League of Nations, a predecessor to the United Nations, was also created by the treaty. This was one of Wilson's famous points and was the condition with the most forethought included in the treaty.
As word of the treaty spread around the globe, a negative response to the treaty resulted. Quote, "The peace conditions imposed on Germany are so hard, so humiliating, that even those who have the smallest expectation of a peace of justice are bound to be deeply disappointed." Unquote. An editorial in the Dutch Algemeen Handelsblad argued, quote, "Whole tracts of Germany will be entirely deprived of their liberty. They will be under a committee of foreign domination, without adequate representation." Unquote. An editorial in the Telegraph said, quote, "It is no time of triumph or soaring hopes." Unquote. The Manchester Guardian called the peace, quote, "largely formal and leaving a door wide open for a renewed struggle." Unquote. Among all the responses, the Germans were the most angry, and with good reason, too. The Germans did not want the treaty signed in the first place, but they had to sign it or be subjected to invasion. The Germans felt they were unfairly treated and felt they were the ones taking the punishment for the German government's actions. The anger toward the treaty in Germany was so great that the Germans gave the signers of the treaty the title November Criminals. A famous political cartoon pictured a hand clenching a man representing Germany, and the dignitaries at the convention forcing the treaty down Germany's mouth with the expression, "You've got to swallow it whether you like it or not." Interestingly, some of the German anger could have been avoided if the armistice had not been called an armistice. In October 1918, it was clear Germany was losing the war. When the Germans had sent out peace feelers to the Allies, they had been sent to President Wilson because he was the most lenient with his famous 14 points that were designed to appease everyone. Wilson refused to consider a truce unless the Kaiser abdicated. A few days later, the Kaiser fled the country.
Although the German government and later Adolf Hitler would portray the armistice as a mutual ceasefire, it was really a German surrender. Whether this treaty was a success or not continues to be a controversial topic. Probably one of the most significant successes that emerged from this treaty was the League of Nations. It brought together multiple nations, establishing peace. However, many failures stain the treaty's name. The League of Nations failed to maintain the long-lasting peace the delegates had hoped for. Ironically, Wilson's beloved League failed because his own country refused to ratify the treaty. Without America's army to support the League failed to be a prominent peacekeeper the delegates had hoped it would be. The treaty was also far too harsh on Germany. The Paris Peace Conference's efforts did accomplish what it had set out to do. The peace would be maintained for nearly 20 years. Where the delegates failed was in the long term. They lacked the foresight necessary to establish a long-lasting peace. One significant consequence of the treaty was the hyperinflation of post-war Germany. At the height of 1923, the exchange rate was $1 for every trillion marks. People often had to carry the money they need in a suitcase to go to the market. Although the post-war Germany hyperinflation was partially due to pre-war decisions, it was also caused by the Treaty of Versailles. Although Germany had left the system of gold-backed marks in 1914, the Treaty of Versailles required that the reparations be paid in gold-backed marks. This helped drive the inflation of post-war Germany. After years of poverty, the German people were angry, and a young orator by the name of Adolf Hitler threw more coals on the fire. The same man would lead to the rise of Nazi Germany.
The Treaty of Versailles, concluding 40 years of war, was successful in ending the First World War. However, the delegates' lack of foresight was a major setback. Many delegates looked only for revenge on Germany, rather than establishing a long-lasting peace. The treaty was far too harsh on Germany, and was key in causing many years of inflation and poverty in post-war Germany. Because of this subjugation of Germany, the German people allowed themselves to be led by a man they believed could restore Germany to its rightful place, Adolf Hitler. Hitler would, after rising to power, begin the Second World War only 20 years later. The Treaty of Versailles was not the sole cause of World War II, but it was a key factor. One cannot prove or disprove that if the Treaty of Versailles had been better constructed, World War II would not have occurred. But one can be sure that the Treaty of Versailles failed to accomplish its primary goal of a long-lasting peace.